Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Gerhard Kasper, and I presently serve as the president of the American Academy. I knew that the subject of taxes would attract a relatively small but extremely high-quality audience. And so I warmly welcome all of you. In one of my prior lives, I was the dean of the law school at the University of Chicago. And the students, the law school, the curriculum is roughly structured in the following way. There are obligatory courses that are taken in the first year, contracts, torts, and so on. And then the rest of the curriculum, the next 2 years, is entirely optional. And tax 1, tax 2, tax 3 belong among those optional subjects. And so students, since I was a dean, they thought I knew something about the curriculum. They were mistaken, but that's neither here nor there. And so they would often ask me, what should I take when I'm through the first year? And I say, take tax. Take tax 1, take tax 2, take tax 3, because no subject at the law school will tell you more about the social and economic structure of the United States than that. And I did not have necessarily many followers, but I had some whom I persuaded. So when I saw that Robin had been asked to come here, had been invited to the Academy, I was just absolutely delighted. Now, we have adopted a rule. This is where Professor Lammert comes in. We have adopted a rule at the Academy that if at all possible, our fellows should be introduced by a genuine German professor. I'm, of course, not that. I'm kind of, but not really. And so we have the great privilege tonight to have Professor Lammert from the Kennedy Institute at the Free University. And it is a John F. Kennedy Institute of North American Studies. And Professor Lammert is a professor of politics, comparative politics, in North American studies. So you see that the jurisdiction is much broader than just the United States, about which he knows a lot, but he also knows a lot, for all I know, even more about Canada. But you won't hear about that tonight. Professor Lammert.
Thank you very much for this introduction. I'm not used to get introduced for being the one who introduces a speaker, but it's a wonderful event here. Yeah, first of all, thank you for the American Academy for hosting this event and inviting me. It's really an honor and pleasure to welcome you all to the Siemens lecture and to introduce tonight's speaker, Professor Robin Einhorn. Robin is Preston Hotchkiss Professor in the History of the United States at the University of California at Berkeley. At the present, she is the Siemens Fellow here at the American Academy in Berlin. Robin received her PhD and master degree from the University of Chicago. In her research, she deals with the complex relationship between Americans and taxation, and that's a real complex relationship, I guess, but I would assume it's the same if you ask Germans or French or Italian people. Furthermore, she focuses on the continuing influence of slavery on the American antipathy towards taxation. And what's so wonderful about her books and her articles is the way how she connects the topic of taxation to broader questions of the development of democracy in America, state development in America, federalism, and slavery. She has published widely on the topic. Let me just briefly mention some books because I want to make it short, and some articles. And some of them I'm using from time to time in my classes as well. The first one is American Taxation and American Slavery, published in 2006, University of Chicago Press. And here I'm using the appendix. It's titled How to Talk About Taxes. And I think this should become mandatory also for politicians in the United States, or even especially maybe for Donald Trump. Same publisher, University of Chicago Press in 2001, a book titled Property Rules, Political Economy in Chicago from 1833 to 1972. And she published, and this is becoming more and more important in Germany as well, widely in peer-reviewed journals like the Journal of Policy History, the Journal of Economic History, and Studies in American Political Development. But Robin is not just an excellent researcher, she also has been honored with a Distinguished Teaching Award at the History of California at Berkeley. As a Siemens Fellow here at the American Academy right now, she works on a new project, if I get it right, that is titled Taxes in U.S. History, Myth and Reality, that set out to explain the origin of American taxes and the occasionally curious debates about them. And if you look at the Republican debates, sometimes it's right into the present, very curious. In that project, she casts new light on historical episodes and uncovers unexpected stories about taxes and taxations. And from my own research and teaching on tax policy, I can only agree. There are a lot of them, and that makes the topic, which most of my students presume to be technical and boring in the beginning, becomes exciting and alive at the end. Her book will outline the transition from the income tax populism of the early 20th century to the anti-tax populism of our time right now. I'm really looking forward to your talk and ask you all to join me in welcoming Robin Einhorn.
So let me start by thanking those of you who came out in the rain to hear a talk about what can seem like a daunting subject. Thank you, Christian, for that wonderful introduction. And of course, thank you to the American Academy in Berlin for allowing me to work full-time on this project in this amazing place. Okay. Although it would be hard to find a historian willing to deny the significance of taxation or tax politics, the topic has attracted remarkably little attention, remarkably little interest from modern scholars. Social and economic historians have long depended on tax systems as data collection instruments, for example, as sources on the distribution of various kinds of property. But the taxes that generated the data have drawn less attention. And I allude to a reason for this on the slide. A picture of the Form 1040, the first one from 1913, that can evoke the tedious, anxiety-inducing, and possibly costly process of filing our own income taxes. Yet, as Joseph Schumpeter noted in one of the field's very few obligatory quotations, the history of taxation can reveal the thunder of world history because, and this is the best part, the budget is the skeleton of the state stripped of all misleading ideologies. Okay, so starting around 2004, scholars and Democratic Party activists started to notice one of the more striking ironies of American politics, that the most conservative states, the ones where anti-tax and anti-spending appeals resonate most strongly, actually benefit the most from federal taxing and spending. This map from The Economist in 2011 gives you one version. And the surplus and deficit language is a little complicated, but what this is saying is that Republican states generally collect more in federal spending than they pay in federal taxes, while Democratic states pay more in taxes than they collect in spending. Other maps and charts making this point have proliferated under headlines like Red State Moochers, or from a site that's actually called liberalbias.com, we get Red State Socialism. Okay, states that give more than they get, states that get more than they give. But interest in the geography of federal taxation really took off in September 2012, with the video of Mitt Romney describing the 47% of Americans, quote, who believe the government has a responsibility to care for them, that they are entitled to health care, to food, to housing, to you name it, and of course, who pay no income tax. Well, it turned out that the Tax Foundation, a relatively nonpartisan research outfit, had posted this 2 years earlier. Using 2008 data, they mapped the percentage of income tax filers in each state who had zero or negative income tax liability, in other words, low-income filers, with red showing the top 10, the states with the most non-payers, and blue showing the bottom 10, the states with the fewest non-payers. Now, the point of citing this map in September 2012 was the expectation that President Obama actually would win the states where the most income tax filers were income tax payers, right? Contra Romney. As indeed he did. But what really leaps from this map, of course, is the role of the South as the nation's non-paying core. Okay? There they are. And tonight I'd like to offer a kind of backstory to this distribution, and especially the role of the South in it, by situating the federal income tax in a longer-term historical context than is usual. We have excellent studies of the spending part of this story on things like rural electrification during the New Deal and military contracting since World War II. But historians have neglected the tax side. It is not just that the income tax, by raising large sums of money, permitted the federal government to redistribute resources in a southward direction, which of course it did. That much is well understood. Rather, it is that this pro-South orientation was and this is my argument, was the purpose of the federal income tax, and the crucial feature that distinguished the 20th century federal tax system from its 19th century predecessor. The 19th century system, resting heavily on import tariffs, favored the North at Southern expense. The 20th century system, resting heavily on the income tax, favored the South at Northern expense. The income tax was adopted in no small part because it would effect this reversal. To show you what I'm talking about, consider the distribution of the income tax burden in 1916, which is the first year with state-level data. The source for this is not obscure. It's the same IRS reports behind the Piketty and Says estimates of income inequality. In other words, this famous, I'm sure you've seen this curve of income inequality. My innovation is merely to break down this national result geographically, okay? And the result is fairly dramatic. States in the darkest color paid a per capita average of over $1, this is 1916 dollars, paid a per capita average of $1 in federal income tax. States in the lightest paid an average of less than 25 cents. Now, rich little Delaware over here was very extreme at $15.75 per capita, but New York's $7, $6.97, produced, and this is the best, produced a full 45% of the total personal income tax. Rhode Island came in third at $3.34, Massachusetts fourth, and Oklahoma, which in 1916 was in the midst of an oil boom, came in fifth at $2.39. But look at the South. South Carolina, 6 cents. Alabama, 9 cents. Arkansas, 10 cents. Mississippi, 13 cents. Georgia, 15 cents. These figures, of course, reflect the distribution of income in 1916, or the grinding poverty of the early 20th century South. But the key is that nobody would have found this map surprising in 1916. This is what the income tax was intended to accomplish. So what I'm going to do with the rest of my time tonight is first describe the before picture, the 19th century system that the income tax replaced. Secondly, trace the origin of the income tax with the evidence that leads me to stress geography, generally in the South in particular. And then finally, present some data I've assembled on the 20th century income tax story. Okay, so the before picture. In the beginning, which in the United States means the 1780s, the framers of the Constitution decided to use a tariff on imported goods as the main source of federal revenue. In itself, this decision was not remarkable. Developing countries everywhere relied on import taxes in this period, mainly because they were easy to collect from a few merchants at the ports, who then shifted them into consumer prices rather than scattered agricultural populations. In the United States, import taxes also had another advantage. They could be framed without reference to the distribution of wealth, which was extremely important because it meant without any discussion of a politically explosive problem, what, or in fact who, counted as wealth in a nation that was already almost half slave and half free. The American plan to use import taxes dated from 1781, when the Congress under the Articles of Confederation started trying to amend that document to authorize them to tax, because originally they couldn't. 12 of the 13 state legislatures approved the amendment twice, but every state had to agree. The Constitution was framed mainly in response to that failure, meaning that, myths about anti-tax founders aside, the United States Constitution was adopted as a fundamentally pro-tax document intended to facilitate federal taxation. And indeed, the first clause of Article 1, Section 8, right, which is the powers of Congress, permits Congress to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises for just about any purpose, the common defense and general welfare, as long as the taxes are uniform. Uniform, meaning set at the same rate everywhere. But there are a few limits in the Constitution. Congress couldn't, still can't, tax exports. And Congress could tax the slave trade only to a maximum of $10 per imported slave, though it actually never taxed the slave trade at all. There was, however, a more serious limit, a requirement that direct taxes be apportioned to the states by population. Now, this rule is obscure and complicated, and I've written about it at length, so if you're interested, I'll be happy to tell you more. But for now, I just want to point to three characteristics of this limit on the federal tax power. First, that it's hiding in plain sight. In the infamous 3/5 clause of the Constitution, as the direct taxes in the phrase, representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned, right, to the states according to their population, which shall be determined by adding the whole number of free persons, indentured servants, not Indians, not yet conquered, and 3/5, that's what not taxed meant, and still free, and 3/5 of all other persons who are, of course, not free. So that's the first thing. It's right there. It's then repeated in Article 1, Section 9. The second important thing about the direct tax rule was its purpose, to protect slave owners against the threat that abolitionists might try to tax slavery out of existence. The representatives part of the clause increased the power of the slave states in Congress, and the direct taxes part was a kind of fail-safe in case the representatives part proved insufficient. The third key aspect of this rule is that its complexity discouraged Congress from trying to tax anything except the imported goods, which is what they wanted to tax anyway. They also tried excises, such as the whiskey tax that provoked a rebellion in 1791, but imports were easier, safer, and had been the plan all along. So in 1788, in the opening days of the first Congress under the Constitution, James Madison, you've heard of him, who was the floor leader, introduced a simple bill to tax imports, at which point he and his colleagues learned something about the government they had designed. They had not anticipated how the structure of Congress would affect tax policy. As we understand only too well, a tax designed by Congress cannot be simple, because the members will insist on provisions to benefit the voters of their districts or other people they want to reward. We know what this means for the modern income tax code. It's an effective jobs program for accountants and lawyers. For the import tax, it meant provisions to protect domestic producers by slapping heavy taxes on their foreign competitors, which is what that first tax law in 1789 did for a list of commodities. Southerners immediately realized that this process of using tax policy for protectionism would benefit Northern producers at their expense, since Northerners produced things like nails, shoes, clothing, and carriages that competed with lower-priced European imports. Protectionism could not benefit the South because the United States did not import anything that competed with the major Southern goods: tobacco in the 1780s, and soon, of course, cotton. The result for the next century was a political paradox: a national consensus supporting the tariff, as the import tax came to be known, as the best way to finance the federal government. This everyone agreed on. But a deep and enduring disagreement over its ever-swelling list of protectionist provisions. Put another way, the tariff was endlessly controversial as an industrial development policy, but not at all controversial as a source of federal revenue. In terms of that revenue, the result was a system dominated by the tariff. The tariff is in blue, okay? All the blue, that's the tariff. Before the Civil War, dominated by the tariff. Where's the Civil War? There it is. The two major interruptions of this dominance came during the Napoleonic Wars, or in the United States, the War of 1812, since these wars disrupted the international trade that produced the revenue. And the other one was this during a speculative land boom in the 1830s that crashed in a depression called the Panic of 1837. There was a whole range of taxes during the Civil War, including an income tax, but most were quickly repealed, with the income tax lapsing in 1872. After the Civil War, the tariff continued to raise about half of federal revenue, with excises mainly on liquor and tobacco. These were called the internal revenue, but they're excises on liquor and tobacco, bringing in most of the rest. This system was universally understood to be sharply redistributive. Regressive in the sense that it was based wholly on consumption taxes, but also very strongly redistributive from south to north. The most famous Southern protest against it, of course, was the nullification crisis of the early 1830s, South Carolina's threat to secede from the Union to escape tariffs that the state's leaders considered to be unconstitutional and unjust. Flat rate import taxes, and the kind of term for this was a tariff for revenue only, were perfectly fine, they argued, but Congress had no power under the Constitution to frame tax laws that protected Northern industries at Southern expense. Unfortunately for John C. Calhoun and the other South Carolina nullifiers, no other state accepted this constitutional analysis, though the other Southern states fully agreed on the claim of injustice. The tariff also had a kind of diabolical political genius. I can show you the proportion of federal revenue that it raised, but I can't show you anything comparable to this income tax map, because the essence of the tariff as a tax is that we can't know the total size of its burden, much less how it was distributed. The distribution problem is the burden's diffusion from merchants to consumers across the country. The size problem is more interesting. that the burden the tariff imposed on consumers consisted of the taxes collected as customs receipts plus the subsidies that protective tariffs gave to firms in protected industries. Since the firms collected their subsidies directly from consumers with no transactions involving the Treasury, their costs did not appear in federal budget data as either taxing or spending. Contemporaries understood this. They knew that the tariff's total burden, the taxes that the public actually paid, were much higher than the revenue receipts. But they didn't know, and we still don't know, how much higher. There were a few guesses. In 1888, a House Ways and Means report estimated the protective subsidies as over 4 times the customs receipts. In 1909, the New York Times guessed that they were 6.5 times the customs receipts. The best modern analysis by economist Douglas Irwin suggests that the true figures may have been higher still. Opponents, moreover, were sure that most of the benefits poured into the coffers of monopolistic firms like the infamous industrial trusts. This is a classic anti-tariff image, right? Where you have farmers, where's the farmer? Here's the farmer. Farmers, laborers, and merchants paying tribute to an insatiable king monopoly, armed with trust certificates in his pocket there, the tariff law, and a bag of money. And what he's crushing is a building labeled American Industries. The caption is, "And he asks for more." Or this one from 1909, in which the trusts tie up the consumer in a maypole dance. You can see steel, lumber, sugar, and wool. Anti-tariff cartoons often figured the trusts and other industrial monopolists as grotesquely fat babies in a reference to the original raison d'etre of protectionism, to encourage the growth of new so-called infant industries. Until they were established enough to compete with foreign imports. The point of the fat babies was that the powerful industrial firms of this period were hardly the vulnerable infants of protectionist theory. Protectionism had another crucial political feature. From the 1830s to the 1930s, it was a partisan issue, with Republicans championing heavy protective tariffs and Democrats opposing them. Democrats attacked the tariff as theft by antisocial monopolists, as in the Puck cartoons, while Republicans defended tariffs as the foundation of American prosperity. Here's a version from Puck's Republican competitor, Judge. So this is a pro-tariff cartoon. The vagabond in the middle is a free trader, shunned by the prosperous farmer and busy worker, both portrayed as beneficiaries of Republican protectionism, right? Look at all the jobs. But to say that an issue was partisan in this period is also to say that it was sectional. The electoral maps of the 1880s, when the tariff dominated national partisan debate, makes this point clearly. There were a few, right, red, of course, is Republicans and blue is Democrats. There were a few northern swing states, but generally, the Republicans won in the north and the Democrats won in the south. And the Republicans also shaped the tariffs to produce this result. The industrial Northeast and upper Midwest benefited most from the protective tariffs, but the Republicans intentionally framed the details to ensure, to buy the West, essentially, to ensure that the West and South were affected differently. First, they courted Western producers with protection for industrial raw materials produced in the West, wool, lumber, coal, and specialty crops, fruits, nuts, dairy. The only important southern use of this strategy involved protection for Louisiana sugar growers. Second, the Republicans courted Western support on the spending side through a huge program of veterans pensions, Civil War veterans pensions. By the 1890s, the pensions came to 40% of total federal spending. Okay, they were big. On what by then had become an income support program for millions of elderly veterans and their survivors. but only for Union veterans and their survivors. Despite periodic Southern demands, the program never extended to veterans of the defunct, not to mention treasonous, Southern Confederacy. Together, the Western tariffs and Union veterans' pensions helped to cement durable Republican coalitions across the North. And they enraged Southerners. The tariffs created a sharply sectional system that took from the South and gave to the North. This was the 19th century tax structure, and there were very good reasons for Southerners to want to change. Okay, the change they wanted was tariff reform, which meant dramatic cuts in the protective duties. Nobody still thought the old demand for a flat rate tariff for revenue only was still plausible, but Democrats wanted to rein in the protective system, especially after an 1892 victory because of populist defections in the West. An 1892 victory put Grover Cleveland in the White House. When's the last time you heard that name? Put Grover Cleveland in the White House and Southerners in charge of both houses of Congress for the first time since the Civil War. The first thing the victorious Democrats did was purge the statute books of all surviving Reconstruction-era protections for African Americans. But after that, they turned to the tariff. The Wilson-Gorman tariff of 1894 was a disappointment. A House bill with deep cuts got mangled in the Senate, but anticipating that their rate cuts would cause budget deficits, the House added and the Senate approved a small income tax to plug the hole. The 1894 tax would have levied a flat 2% on incomes above $4,000, which today would be about $112,000. But that tax never went into effect because the Supreme Court ruled it unconstitutional in the 1895 case of Pollock versus Farmers Loan and Trust Company. Now, it's easy to exaggerate the significance that Congress attached to the income tax in 1894. We know that the income tax had a big future. But the 1894 struggles centered on the tariff rates, though there were some rhetorical fireworks about the income tax in the language of class conflict. David Hill, a New York Democrat, attacked income tax supporters as, quote, little squads of anarchists, communists, and socialists. The Supreme Court also, in the Pollock case, invoked the specters of socialism, anarchism, and class warfare. But the sectional aspects of the debate were also clear. This guy, David Hill, the New York Democrat, as a Democrat, supported the tariff cuts. As a New Yorker, however, New York Democrats were often free traders, in part to represent import-export merchants who were their constituents, in part because of their ties to reform intellectuals who thought tariffs were terrible, who were free traders on theoretical grounds, and in part because the anti-tariff Southerners were their party allies. The income tax frayed this coalition. Hill supported the tariff cuts as a Democrat, but thought the income tax was, quote, a vicious scheme to extort money from New York. Here's Puck, also speaking for the New York Democrats. Uncle Sam is courting tariff reform. The Wilson bill, it's not Woodrow Wilson. It's another guy, Ways and Means Chairman William L. Wilson of West Virginia. But anyway, tariff reform, the Wilson bill, says take it or leave it with the dog. The dog's part of the deal. It says, love me, love my dog. And Uncle Sam is not happy. Right? It says income tax on the collar. Okay. So that's the Northern Democrats. That's Puck. The Republicans were less restrained. Judge depicted the whole tariff bill, including the income tax, as highway robbery. So the carriage is Northern industries. The victim is the North. With a handkerchief, his handkerchief says Northern thrift. And he's held by behind from the Northern Free Trade Democrats, that is, the Puck guys, while the supporters of tariff reform, but the central figure is the Southern Democrat who plucks the North's wallet while aiming a gun. I don't know if you can see the little tag coming out of the gun, but it says income tax. Or here's Judge again. aiming at the income tax even more directly. The caption identifies the guy in the cape as a Democratic senator and ex-Confederate brigadier. You can see it says CSA on his hat, right? Confederate States of America. And he's holding a sword marked rebellion and secession. The North is the dying woman, stabbed by a pen identified as legislation, specifically meaning the income tax. In the caption, our brigadier proclaims, quote, "Take away the sword, states can be ruined without it. Bring me the pen is mightier than the sword." The point being that the income tax was the revenge of the Southern Confederacy. In a delicious irony, the Supreme Court rescued the wealthy or thrifty Northerners from the income tax in the Pollock case by invoking the 3/5 clause. Rejecting post-Civil War precedents to the contrary, the majority claimed that the income tax was a direct tax, which therefore had to be apportioned to the states by population instead of by income. For example, since New York had only about 10% of the nation's population, it could pay only 10% of the income tax, which was plainly absurd given the concentration of wealth in the state. As we've seen, in 1916, New York didn't pay 10%, it paid 45%. But the point, the court's point, the justice's point, was not to design an absurd tax, it was to kill the income tax. And what's awesome here is that the justices took a constitutional text that had been framed a century earlier to protect Southern slaveholders and used it to protect Northeastern industrial, commercial, and financial elites against the South. After the Pollock ruling, the income tax basically disappeared from national politics until the next big round of tariff reform. This was 1909, and as part of a complex political deal, the core of which was tariff reform, Congress sent the states the text that would become the 16th Amendment. The amendment allowed an income tax. Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes on incomes without any apportionment and without regard to any census or enumeration. Most Southern states rushed to ratify the 16th Amendment. Virginia and Florida rejected it, but the others took the lead. Alabama was first. There's Alabama first, followed by Kentucky, South Carolina, Mississippi, Maryland, Georgia, and Texas. Now, I should point out that this Southern enthusiasm does not explain the amendment's ultimate success. Constitutional amendments have to be ratified by 3/4 of the state legislatures, and that result required a separate Northern development. In 1910 and 1912, the Republican Party split across the North between its progressive and conservative wings, right? Theodore Roosevelt, the Progressive Party. The most famous outcome of this split was the election of the Democrat Woodrow Wilson to the presidency in 1912. But the split also brought Democrats to power, the Republican split brought Democrats to power in northern state legislatures, which is how even New York and Massachusetts came to ratify the 16th Amendment. When Northerners debated with each other about the amendment, they argued about class conflict, monopoly, and social justice. Only the Southern legislatures treated the income tax as a states' rights problem, a trade-off between financial benefits and the threat that a stronger federal government would let Northerners interfere with Southern white supremacist policies, by this point disfranchisement, segregation, and the rampant lynching of African Americans. As recently as 1890, Republicans had tried to pass a voting rights law called the Lodge Election Bill, failing narrowly and very bitterly. In 1909, however, President William Howard Taft used his inaugural address to assure white Southerners that any such aspirations were history, that the federal government would not, quote, interfere with the regulation by the Southern states of their domestic affairs. When Southern legislatures debated about whether to ratify the income tax amendment, therefore, the key issue was whether they believed this Republican promise. In other words, was white supremacy safe? Everyone knew that the South would benefit from the income tax. The plan was to levy it only on the very rich, few of whom lived in the South. The income tax was also widely seen as a prerequisite for tariff reform, right? How are we going to cut the tariffs if we don't have another source of revenue? On the other side, however, memories of the Civil War and Reconstruction competed with the reassurances from the White House. In Florida, for example, a legislator opposed the amendment because he did, quote, not believe, this is great, Florida, okay, did not believe in going back and saying to the national government that we were wrong in our contentions in the Civil War, right? And beg forgiveness and promise like a whipped child never to do it again, right? We can't be having that. The income tax would mean Republican patronage employees, quote, in every city, hamlet, and village, and we might have a number of gentlemen of the color of Joseph E. Lee. Lee was an African-American Republican who had served in the Florida legislature as a judge and in federal revenue jobs. A Georgia legislator also did not trust Republican administrations to, quote, appoint all white collectors in the South. They might fill Georgia, quote, with federal collectors, white and black, asking us all about our incomes, looking into our books, querying how much cotton we made last year, what our income was. In the same vein, a Virginian recoiled at the prospect of, quote, a Negro entering his home and assessing the income from the sale of eggs and butter. Quote, perhaps at some time a South-hating man might be president, another warned, and Negroes might fill these positions. The income tax could revive Reconstruction, quote, the days of oppression, when the North had sent satraps to the South to enter every home and go to every crossroads after the Civil War. The New Orleans Picayune reminded Louisiana legislators about men still living who remembered Reconstruction, quote, who know from actual experience that there was no act of despotic injustice and oppression which the government failed to perpetrate on the southern states. With the power to levy the income tax, quote, the conquerors in the Civil War would do it again. Supporters in the Southern legislatures answered with the obvious. Northerners would pay most of the tax. It was a prerequisite for tariff reform, and white supremacy was perfectly safe. A self-identified, quote, humble survivor of the lost cause in Virginia appealed to sons of men who followed Lee to stand by what fathers fought for by voting no on the amendment. But a similarly elderly Georgian supported ratification, even though he, quote, had given some years of his life to the fight of the 60s, right, the 1860s, for states' rights. And he never thought he would vote for anything like this, giving more power to the central government. But they did vote to give more power to the central government. Most Southern legislatures not only ratified early, but in landslide margins. But the real punchline is not that Southern white supremacists recognize their economic interests, though there is always something heartening about economic interests trumping racist fears and fantasies. Right, U.S. history. The real punchline is the rest of the story. You've already seen this at least twice, but I've also assembled this data for the next century. Okay, so here's the distribution in 1916. Here's 1936 with a pretty similar pattern, and here's 1956 also. There are minor changes, right, you get them again. There are minor changes from map to map. Some just are artifacts of my category cutoffs. I went for round numbers. But the continuities are pretty clear. The changes came in the second half of the 20th century. What you see here is a little complicated, but it's a representation of Southern convergence. So here's how I made this chart, personal income tax per capita. To make this chart, I collected the per capita tax data by state at 5-year intervals from 1916 to 2011, aggregated the states into regions, and plotted the relationship between the regional averages and the national averages. I constructed the chart this way because the money values changed too much over a century to fit in a single frame. So what do we have here? The Midwest and West converge with the South at about World War II. But the South lags visibly, that's the green line, the South lags visibly until about 1980. The Northeast has trended back up since the 1990s, presumably due to the financialization of the economy, but this is still an overall story of convergence. The question is what this convergence means. Obviously, it reflects the larger geography of economic growth in the 20th century, particularly the transition from cotton belt to sun belt in the South and the rusting of the old industrial belt in the North. Right? Southerners got richer, so they paid more income tax. It also reflects a big change in the tax. During World War II, the income tax was transformed from a class tax levied only on the very rich to a mass tax on most people. In 1936, 5.4 million Americans had to file income tax returns. 10 years later, 1946, 10 times that number had to file, right, from 5.4 to 52.6 million, so a dramatic change. But this convergence also means something else. As I suggested at the start, historians of sectional redistribution usually stress the spending side. Interestingly, so do most historians of the tax revolt. The anti-tax politics that began in the late 1970s won big federal tax cuts under Reagan and George W. Bush and inspired much of the Tea Party movement. Spending side explanations of the tax revolt emphasize a racially inflected, to kind of put it nicely, a racially inflected backlash against a supposedly generous welfare state. This is Romney's 47% line, echoed this week by Jeb Bush and Marco Rubio, who are attacking Democrats for offering their supporters, quote, free stuff at taxpayer expense. But what my data here suggest is a tax-based explanation, not in addition to the spending. Together with my findings about the origin of the income tax, they suggest a larger story in which Southerners demanded the tax when they wouldn't have to pay it, and began opposing it, becoming, around 1980, anti-tax Republicans, as soon as they started paying as much as everyone else, right? Which is what this is. Now, I have no interest in downplaying the role of racist backlash in the tax revolt, though a straightforward interest-based piece of the story is as heartening here as in the 1910s. More generally, though, I want to highlight the influence of the interests that have predominated within Southern politics on the national history of American taxation, which leaves us with one question. Why Southern interests and power are not already part of this story? Why what I'm saying could possibly be new? And I think the answer is fairly simple. Historians tend to treat American political history as a Northern affair, pushing Southern developments into a regional subfield that concentrates on local problems and issues. As a result, the things that Northerners argued about get portrayed as the things that Americans argued about, including when they argued about the South. My work stresses the role of Southerners in national politics and the ways they debated about it with each other. It is no accident that some of our best historical sources, such as Puck and Judge on the tariff and income tax, articulate the views of Northerners in general and New Yorkers in particular. That's what happens when a city dominates the publishing industry. We have to resist the temptation of automatically calling Northern concerns the concerns of Americans. And so I might as well end here with another Puck, the voice of the New York Democrats, glossing the roots of the income tax. So it's Thanksgiving. And the fat monopolist is taking a nap after gorging on his dinner of high tariff plunder. It's called high tariff plunder. Protected monopolist, high tariff plunder. And he has a bad dream. His tariff Turkey is resurrected as a terrifying income tax. And it serves him right. Had he been less greedy, the turkey's bones might have stayed on the plate. There is no room in the world of this image for any factors other than the tariff reform morality play of the Northern Democrats. On the other hand, like the other Puck and Judge images, it's pretty irresistible. Thanks. Thanks.
Thank
Michael.
you, Robin. Fantastic.
Okay.
She's a professor, so she can take her own question.
Yes. Thanks. Michael, yeah.
Okay, so I wanted to ask you about the way in which you were talking about North and South as blocks, and particularly the way in which you were doing so in regard to economic interests. And the fact that you then did not feel it was necessary, and maybe there's a good reason why you didn't feel it was necessary, you can enlighten me. Why, to what extent divisions among economic interest in the North by the late 19th century, including those who were more interested in exporting or importing cheap goods, did not help explain why the North would be willing to support a turn towards an income tax. I mean, after all, the original trust, since you showed that thing of trust, was a major exporter, multinational exporter, Standard Oil.
Ah. Okay, so the big Western export crop is wheat. I mean, oil's fine, but wheat was, you know, the big Western export crop. And Westerners did tend to support the income tax. But the bigger voting numbers come from the South. I mean, much larger bloc in Congress. And what historians have generally done is said the West and South, agrarian interests, promoted the income tax. And when you say agrarian interests, and you're meant to think of this northern homesteader growing wheat, you know, you're not meant to think of Southern white supremacists who were the voting, of whom there were more, right? So the West has more power in the Senate by this time than in the House, right? Because they have low populations, but there have been some strategic admissions of states to bring more Republican votes. The other thing about the West is that, and this is where the Republican policy of buying them off had been really successful, the veterans' pensions and the tariffs for particular Western products. Now, there is, of course, a question of how do you define these regions, which states count as what. And I purposely made the South a hard case by using the census definition that includes Maryland and Delaware in the South, even though they were much richer and paid much higher income. So they made this. So I showed you how low the Southern numbers were, but they are actually even lower. So I don't know if that answers your question. Yeah, please.
Shortly before the First World War and the Wilson action on tariffs, the United States and Germany had practically surpassed Britain in industrial power.
Yeah.
Now, this changes the national interest in tariff policy, because once you are a big economic power, you want other countries to open up. And for them to open up, you must yourself open up. So it's not only, I think, a party issue, but it's an issue of the national interest also.
Okay, there's some really interesting things about this. And I just looked at some numbers comparing German tariffs from this period with American. The German are so much lower. We think of Germany as a high tariff, but they don't compare to the American tariffs. The other big thing, though, is that the American tariff didn't really fall until 1934. Right, because Smoot-Hawley, right, 1930. The American tariffs didn't really fall until 1934. And the reason when Congress adopted the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act. And the reason it's 1934 is that Democrats finally dominate the federal government. In other words, you can say that a nation has an interest, but in a highly contentious political system, I think it's the interests within that are represented much more strongly. But what happens with the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act? What that law does is it takes tariff making out of Congress and sends it basically to the State Department. And what that means is the whole kind of congressional tariff-making process with its log rolling and just upward pressure to give goodies to constituents really is destroyed. That's what Franklin Roosevelt and the Democrats do with the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act. So that's what, and then you can have someone whose constitutional role is to represent the national interest having a big influence on tariffs, right? That's what that does, but it's not in the 1910s, it's in the 1930s that this happens. And the tariffs really nosedive after that, but not really before, so.
Well, I would say the return of the Republicans to a high tariff policy in 1921-22 has a lot to do with Germany also, because Germany was then in that hyperinflationary phase, and the depreciation of the mark was so great that Germany's industry could undercut any other industry in the world. And when the tariff bill was debated in Congress, there was an article in the Chicago Tribune entitled "The Cuckoo in the Tariff."
Really?
Because someone who was asked in Congress had said that no American firm could compete with producers of German cuckoo clocks.
Oh, I see. I thought the cuckoo clocks were Swiss. Okay. Okay. Yeah, I mean, those
So
19...
that was a reaction also.
No, I take the point that it was not irrelevant. But the Republicans, you know, were the high tariff party all along. I mean, really, I mean, the continuity here is so striking. You know, for an entire century, well, there aren't Republicans for an entire century, but there are Whigs and then Republicans who, you know, champion high tariffs like all the way through, no matter what ups and downs in the international economy happen. In other words, I don't want to say that the international economy is irrelevant, but when I look at what these debates sounded like, expressions of the national interest are few and far between. These guys in Congress are representing their constituents. I mean, that's just what it looks like to me. Would that it were that, right? I mean,
Thank you very much, Robin. That's really terrific talk. I want to ask a really ignorant question. I'm going back to your early slides about maps of who gives and who gets. Now, it looks as though those sorts of maps or data like that would be a very potent political weapon in the debate. Is that so? When do these sorts of things, when do politicians become aware of these kinds of distributions?
yeah.
What use can they make of them? And why aren't they more effective today?
Well, look, around 2004, in response to the Bush tax cuts, that's when you really started to get this discussion. That's when these images, these maps started to circulate on the internet. Now, that's, yeah, when it happened. And then, of course, in 2012, the floodgates opened. Now, did it help Democrats win this or that? I don't know. But in other words, I can explain its response much more easily. I mean, why it happened much more easily than I can explain its influence on the ultimate political outcomes. Yeah.
Can I just follow up?
Please.
Why did nobody have access to this sort of information, say, from the middle of the 19th century onwards, about
The middle of the 19th century.
where the money was going and where it was flowing.
Okay, the middle of the 19th century. The thing about the tariff is the big numbers were just unknowable. That's what was so great about it politically, right? It was unknowable. The data that we use and this is the Piketty and Says data too. It comes from the IRS, and this series starts in 1913 with the income tax. Now, another series I could have showed you is we have the same data for the corporation income tax as well. But I wanted to kind of use the personal income tax just for the obvious reasons. So the Internal Revenue Bureau, as it was then called, could say how much of whiskey excises were paid in which states. But who really cares? Because it's diffused. So what if you found out that Kentucky paid a lot of the whiskey tax? What does that tell you? That Kentucky paid a heavy tax? No. That Kentucky produced the whiskey, right? That was then. So these consumption taxes really didn't make it possible to lay out this kind of data. That's what I got.
Robin, could you go back to the tax return with which you started?
Sure.
There is an element here that shows us that this tax was progressive.
Yes.
Right? So my question is, what role does ideology play in all of this?
Yeah. So most people who tell this story tell it as an ideological story. Liberalism happened, and liberals, the tariff distorted the economy and income tax. William Graham Sumner favored an income tax because it would not distort the economy the way tariffs did. So anyway, but the German universities produced the American economists who started looking at the economy and saying we must modernize. This is the way the story is usually told. And I don't doubt that happened for a second. But when I read what these politicians are saying, that's just not what they're saying. People who it's not that they don't read E.R.A. Seligman or whatever. Some of them do. But the people most likely to read the liberal economists are defending New York's wealth against the pitchfork-holding populists, and the Southerners in particular. So I don't doubt that happened. That totally did happen. I don't see it as the causal engine of the story. I see politics as and this just direct competition for advantage, which is, interest group politics. That's how I see it working. But again, of course that happened. Yeah. Pat.
I just wanted to make sure that I was clear about what your thesis was. So,
Yeah.
It seems as though you're saying there are two reasons why the South went along with the income tax. They thought white supremacy would be protected and they would get a great financial benefit.
Totally.
So I just wondered whether you want to then, how much of the racial story you want to continue, because it seems to me it's perfectly compatible with everything you've said, that what happened then was that the Southern tax burden went up, and then there's a theory about where the tax dollars that are coming to your state are going. And it's going to people who've got a lot of melanin in their skin.
I thought you were going to say, and then black people started being allowed to vote.
Right. No. But so it's really a combination of the two. I mean, it was always racism and financial advantage at the beginning, and the reason you flip the other way, that is that you're now opposed to taxes, is that the racism and the financial advantage have both flipped. So it's not just, so you're telling the story as it's the influx of money that, as opposed to the outgo of money that's telling, but aren't you really just saying that's another part of it?
Of
that
course.
It's still, yeah. Okay, so
But it's
you're
a
not-
part of it that hasn't been,
Yeah, no.
in other words,
It's complementary in a way to the racist story. Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. No, you would be foolhardy to minimize the importance of white supremacy in American history. I mean, that's just not something you can do.
But also just the myth of who gets welfare.
But to say that racism explains everything is going too far and makes you not ask these other questions, that's all. Yeah. All right, thanks for your patience, everybody.